Welcome to the fourth web talk in our series on extremism and anti-Semitism. I'm Andrea Spindle, the Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. Some people have sent expressions of gratitude and appreciation for this series and for specific presentations, but it won't surprise many of you that CAEF has now been accused by alt-left extremists of being anti-Islamic and of censoring Palestinian voices and of denying Palestinian Arab rights. The Twitter feed of a specific anti-Semite has labeled CAEF a racist organization that cannot call itself an organization about social justice and human rights. That we have gained the attention of anti-Zionists and anti-Semites is probably a sign of our success. CAEF is not anti-Muslim, but it is anti-jihadi, anti-Islamism, anti-Semitism, and for Israel and Zionism. Samuel Johnson, who has been described as arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history, said, "I would rather be attacked than unnoticed. For the worst thing you can do to an author is to be silent as to his works. While I am not a person of letters, nor distinguished in any way, but I would agree that being attacked for what I am doing and what CAEF stands for is far better than remaining silent and obscure." Our fellow Jews in Israel and as well as across North America and beyond need us. They need us to be aware, alert, and active on several fronts as we face anti-Semitism from many sources. We ask for your support so we can continue to deliver important webinars and take action. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Muriel and Gershon Koren Charitable Foundation, and we have many promotional partners. I won't name all the organizations right now as the list is long, but please note the slide at the end of today's program and know that we are deeply appreciative to all for their promotional support. As well, I would like listeners to know that CAEF is partnering on projects with some of our sponsors to share resources, take concerted actions such as standing together at End Jew Hatred events, generating letters or petitions for cooperative advocacy initiatives. The Jewish world has to do more to stand together, to overcome differences of perspectives when the one shared reality is that we are all equally at risk. If you are looking at becoming involved or are struggling with what actions to take, who to support, how to interpret the happenings around you, I urge you to contact any of our sponsors that operate in your area, or contact me directly and I will try to connect you or involve you directly. You can make a difference. Someone who has just made a huge difference to my understanding of history and historical events is today's guest speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Herf. Dr. Herf is Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Maryland in College Park, where he teaches modern European history with a focus on Germany since 1914. Jeffrey Herf has many publications to his credit with titles such as Reactionary Modernism, Technology, Culture, and Politics in Weimar and the Third Reich, Divided Memory, the Nazi Past and the Two Germanys, New Propaganda for the Arab World, Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany, and the West German Far Left. His most recent book, which we have promoted with this webinar, is Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition for Establishing the Jewish State from 1945 to 1949. It is also he has also published much in journals such as the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs, the New Republic, Fathom Journal, and in popular publications like Tablet Magazine, Die Welt, the Washington Post, and the Times of Israel. Recently, I listened to an academic institute's webinar featuring Dr. Herf, and I heard him conclude by stating that now people will know the truth about the establishment of Israel and give up some of the myths associated with it. I think we are all very keen to know the truth and to be alert to myths and lies about Israel. And you may be astonished to learn how far back these lies were seeded and how so much was done to undermine the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland in Israel. I think you will very much enjoy what you hear from Dr. Herf, and I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. If you use the chat to share information, please be respectful. This webinar is being recorded, and I now welcome Jeffrey Herf.
Ms. Spindle, thank you very, very much for that kind introduction. And thank you as well to the very sizable number, now over 100 people who are listening in on this webinar. My work came to the attention of Andrea Spindle this summer, following the publication of an essay that I wrote in the American New York-based online magazine, The Tablet magazine. The essay is called "The Nazi Roots of Islamist Hate," and I've requested that the link to that essay be placed in the chat. So those of you who are connected to this call can easily get the link to that essay. And what I would like to do in the next 35 to 40 minutes, and leaving time for some questions, is to very, very briefly go over the essay that I published in the tablet, and then turn to a summary of some salient points of Israel's moment, published by Cambridge University Press in March in Britain, and then in the United States and Canada, and around the English-speaking world in April. The the bottom line of the essay that I wrote for the tablet is the following. In 1945 and 1946, American liberals and leftists, as well as advocates of the Zionist project in the United States, urged the government of the United States to bring Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, to trial for war crimes based upon his collaboration and propaganda activities during the war and the Holocaust. In the course of making those requests to the State Department, the American Zionist Emergency Council, Stephen Wise and Abba Silver, the editor of The Nation magazine, Frieda Kirchway, the journalist I.F. Stone, the Congressman Emanuel Seller, the Senator Robert Wagner, and others, brought evidence about the history of Husseini's Nazi collaboration. And the memos that they proposed and offered are very striking, and I offer them in Israel's moment, but they failed. And there was no indictment of, quote, the Mufti in 1945 and 46. In 1945, he was arrested by the French army in May, and then was under house arrest near Paris. The French government had him under house arrest. And that year, American liberals and leftists and Zionist advocates urged the French government to deport, or rather to send Husseini to Nuremberg to be placed on trial. But the French government, and here the book goes into the French government archives of that year, the Foreign Ministry archives, concluded that preserving its colonial presence in North Africa and the Middle East required getting on the good side of Husseini. So there was no trial of the Mufti in 1945-46. There were scholars such as Joseph Schechtman, who in the 1960s wrote a book about Husseini's collaboration. But the story of Arab collaboration with the Nazis remained in the background, but it was revived in Germany in 1988 in a doctoral dissertation by Klaus Gensieke about the Mufti of Jerusalem and his collaboration with the Nazis, which was based upon then declassified files of the German Foreign Ministry and other relevant German government and Nazi government files. The point was not, as Benjamin Netanyahu mistakenly claimed, that Husseini was a decision maker in the Holocaust. He was not a decision maker in the Holocaust. He wasn't a major player. He was a man on the run, and he was lucky to be alive in Berlin, given that the British were trying to arrest him earlier. But while not a major decision maker in the Nazi regime, and that was an exaggeration, nevertheless, he played a significant role in merging Nazi propaganda with themes of Islamist Jew hatred. And before he went to Berlin in 1937, he published a classic essay called Islam and the Jews, which a German political scientist, Matthias Kunzel, in Hamburg, near Hamburg, then discussed in a book published in 2002 called Jihad and Jew Hatred. I wrote the foreword to that book. And in 2009, I published Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, which was based on German and State Department files about all of this. So the bottom line of this, of the article in the tablet, was that a burst of scholarship has taken place since 9/11 that confirms the arguments of the immediate post-war years in New York and in Washington regarding the collaboration of a man who became the leader of the Arab Higher Committee, and in 1947 made the decision to reject the United Nations partition resolution that would have created a Palestine Arab state and a Jewish state in former British Mandate Palestine. And so the upshot of my work and of the work of Kunzel is that anti-Semitism in the Arab world was not primarily a product or a result of the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine. Rather, certainly regarding the leadership that launched the war against the Jews in 1947-48, that their pre-existing anti-Semitic sentiments were the cause of the war, the fundamental cause of the war, the fundamental reason why the Arabs, given the opportunity to establish a state of their own in 1947, rejected the possibility of establishing a state of their own on half of the territory of what had been British Mandate Palestine, and instead insisting on getting everything through war. So that was the essence of the tablet article that drew Andrea Spindle's attention. The article is free. It doesn't cost you a dime to read it. Just click on that link and you can read it, and it's an overview of the recent scholarship. But I've written a 500-page book, and that costs money. You know, writers, scholars, we like to be paid for what we do, just like rock stars and lawyers and other people. But in all seriousness, Israel's moment is the result of research in the archives of the United States government, in its State Department, in the Pentagon, and the Central Intelligence Agency, in the archives of the French Foreign Ministry and the French Interior Ministry, in the United Nations documents of the General Assembly and the Security Council, and in the public records of American politics. I'm sure there's much to do about Canadian politics in 1945, 46, 47, and the book does not address that. But the drama at the United Nations had a great deal to do with American politics, and the book examines that. So, summarizing the book as follows. As Andrea Spindle's comments suggested at the outset, there is a widespread view, articulated first by the Soviet Union and by the Arab League, then by the Palestine Liberation Organization, and in the 1960s and 70s, according to which Zionism is a form of racism, and the state of Israel is the product of Anglo-American imperialism, a colonial settler entity that expelled the native inhabitants by aliens who had no right to be there in the first place, and that this was an example of Orientalism, imperialism, racism, what have you. Endlessly repeated in world politics, it now has gained a foothold in too many, not all, but too many departments of Middle Eastern studies and in editorial rooms. So here are some of the leading conclusions of Israel's moment based upon this research. First, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, offered crucial support for the establishment of the Jewish state. And many of you are very, very familiar with the story of Harry Truman and the support for the partition resolution of November 1947, and then for the recognition of the new state of Israel in May of 1948. So in no way do I mean to minimize at all the importance of what the president did. But even more important, more consequential for the establishment of the state of Israel was the support that came both diplomatically and then militarily from the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. First at the United Nations and most obviously at the United Nations. Following the anti-cosmopolitan, anti-Semitic purges that began in 1949 in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union did all it could to suppress the memory of the era, the brief but consequential era of Soviet Zionism. But the records, the public records, are very, very clear. And those records are available to all of you. Because if you have a computer, and obviously you do, if you're listening to me at the moment, they are available with a bit of research and some skill and learning a few tricks. They are available in the records of the General Assembly and the Security Council. Okay, that's the cover of the book. This is Abba Silver and Stephen Wise, co-chairs of the American Zionist Emergency Council. Let's leave it there. The second point is that due to the understandable attention devoted to President Truman's decisions, historians have not paid sufficient attention to the resolute and consequential opposition to the Zionist project from the United States State Department, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency, and the British Foreign Office. And it's under the leadership of Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin. Israel's moment presents more evidence than has been presented before about what I'm calling an anti-Zionist consensus that existed not only among what were called the Arabist American diplomats who had been ambassadors in the Arab states, but at the top levels of the United States national security establishment. And that included the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who had been a five-star general and the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in World War II. And then perhaps the most famous American diplomat of the 20th century, George F. Kennan, who was the director of something called the Policy Planning Staff. The institutions, in other words, that would fit under the rubric of American imperialism, the State Department, the Pentagon, the Central Intelligence Agency, the British Foreign Office. These institutions and the people who led them in 1945 to 49 all opposed the establishment of the Jewish state, and I'll explain. And they did that. They opposed it for two fundamental reasons. First, they believed that the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine would so infuriate the Arab states and the Arab League that the Arabs would impose an oil boycott on Western Europe, the United States, and Canada as well, at a time when the United States was beginning to launch the policy of the containment of communism and to reconstruct the economies of Western Europe, and oil was, of course, crucial. The second theme that animated their opposition was that they associated the Zionist project with communism. So the anti-communist argument at the very, very early months of the Cold War was also an anti-Zionist one. Again, the Zionist project did not fit well with what people customarily call American imperialism. Third, the most emphatic sources of support for the Zionist project in Western Europe, especially in France, but also in the United States, came from liberals and left of center advocates. In the United States, support extended across the aisle to something we don't have anymore in the United States. That's moderate Republicans. They're an extinct breed in the United States now, but they existed back then, and so support for the Zionist project extended from even leftists and liberals to moderates, and the book goes into the publications such as The Nation and the New York Post or PM, who viewed the Zionist project as part of the post-war wave of anti-colonialism. And that support for the Zionist project, in their view, was a logical continuation of the anti-Nazi and anti-fascist sentiments of the Second World War, and who, especially in the pages of the left-leaning Nation, raised the issue of Nazi collaboration by the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee. So one of the things that Israel's moment tries to do is to remind readers of how different the meanings of racism and anti-racism, imperialism and anti-imperialism, colonialism and anti-colonialism, how different those things were in the late 1940s as they were since the 1970s. Let's take the issue of race and racism. One of the important speeches delivered first in London and then in New York by Jamal Husseini, who was the representative of the Arab Higher Committee, the organization that purported that was given the honor of representing the Palestine Arabs at the United Nations in 1947 and 1948. The Palestine Arabs were well represented by the Arab Higher Committee. John Husseini was articulate and he was emphatic. He was a presence. They had just as much representation there, even more than the Jews, because the Arab states also were making their case. But both in London and then again in September in New York, Jamal Husseini gave about a 30-page denunciation of the Zionist project and why he opposed it, which he called the Zionist invasion. But he made some interesting arguments about race, which have been either ignored or forgotten. And he said the Arab world is a racial homogeneity in the Mediterranean, composed of people who speak one language and the same territory. He was ignoring the Christians and Jews of the Middle East. And this, what he called homogeneity in race, was a precondition for peace and stability in the region. And he opposed the Zionist project because it would destroy this homogeneity in race and introduce multi-ethnicity and an alien presence in an otherwise homogeneous world. In other words, Jamal Husseini, in the language of 2022 and the offices of diversity and inclusion, would be understood as somebody who rejected multi-ethnicity and rejected multiculturalism. And while there's no point in overheating the debate and saying he was, quote, a racist, his views about race were not compatible with what we today think of as acceptance of coexistence and toleration of people from different ethnic and religious groups. One of the great successes of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the in the decades since the 1960s was to have repressed the memory of Jamal Husseini's arguments about race in the 1940s, and also to have repressed the memory of the extent to which these ideas about race and homogeneity had something to do with the rejection of the Zionist project. The the audience in this call is, I would assume, familiar with the famous episode of the Exodus refugee ship, which in the summer of 1947 was hoping to bring Jewish refugees from France to pre-state Palestine, but was prevented from doing so by the British Navy. The ships came back. They were offshore of France. The French Interior Ministry refused to disembark them. It became a major public relations disaster for the British Foreign Office. Opinion in Europe and the United States, both for emotional and political reasons, moral reasons, became more and more sympathetic to the Zionist project. At the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine met over that summer, and the result by August appeared to be that a majority of the countries on that committee were preparing to support the partition resolution. And it's at that point that the British Foreign Office and the State Department conclude that a counteroffensive is necessary. And Israel's Moment then explores the communications between Ernst Bevin and George Marshall, and also the response of representatives of the American oil industry. In September of 1947, William Eddy, former consultant to the Arab American Oil Corporation, Aramco, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, special assistant to Secretary of State George Marshall, wrote a memo for Marshall in which he concluded that the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine would be a disaster for American national security interests, both for reasons of oil and for the Cold War issues of communism and anti-communism. That was followed in September and October by something called the Pentagon Talks, which reached a similar conclusion that the position of the United States in the Middle East was one that placed the preservation of British power in the region as, quote, in Marshall's terms, the cornerstone of American policy in the region. And the preservation of British power and presence in the region meant preventing a Jewish state in Palestine, because the Jewish state was at that point in conflict with Britain, and was then viewed like the anti-colonial efforts in India and elsewhere as in opposition to the preservation of the British Empire in the region. The decisive articulation of American opposition to the establishment of the Jewish state was made by George F. Kennan in January and February of 1948. George Kennan was by then very famous in the United States for being the author of a long telegram in 1946 warning about the Soviet Union, and arguing, making the case for the need for a policy of containment. The arguments in Kennan's very eloquent memos of January and February of 1948 were not especially novel, but they were important both because they were well argued and because they came from Kennan. A memo like that coming from Eddy or from Loy Henderson, head of the Division of African and Middle Eastern Affairs, could have been dismissed as from the oil lobby or from the Arabists. But with Kennan, the opposition to the Jewish state now became part of the policy of containment. uh, and uh, and he was very emphatic that the establishment of the Jewish state would be a blow to American national security interests. Um, again, these documents have been declassified for many years, and yet the notion persists somehow that the state of Israel was a product of Western and British imperialism, when in fact the both the power ministries in London and in Washington were doing all they could to prevent it from happening. Finally, the president got fed up with Marshall and Kennan and Lovett, Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett's efforts to challenge his own policy. He brought policy back into the White House. His lawyer, Clark Clifford, gave him arguments as to why a new Jewish state would be an asset and not a liability to the United States. But the president, but the State Department had articulated a policy of embargo on arms to the Middle East, beginning in the fall of 1947. And that embargo then became a policy adopted by the United Nations. And President Truman could not, in the spring of 1948, merely because of the Israel issue, fire the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who was one of the most, next to the president, the most famous and popular figure in American public life, or Lovett and Kennan. He couldn't fire his entire national security leadership in order to send arms to the Jews. So the United States did not send arms to the Jews. And when the Jews needed arms in the spring of 1948, they came from communist Czechoslovakia, which did so through a mixture of persistent anti-Nazism and also wanting to make money by selling arms. Just a few more comments. Given the war in Ukraine and Russia's war of aggression and the lies that Putin articulated in beginning the war about Ukrainian Nazis, without wanting to obscure difficult realities of the Holocaust there, in the summer of 1948, Vasyl Tarasenko, the United Nations ambassador of the Ukrainian SSR, was on a rotating seat in the United Nations with Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet representative. And that summer, Count Foca Bernadotte, with support from the Americans and the British, floated proposals in the midst of the war of 48 to amputate the Negev desert from a future Jewish state. And now I will share a screen. This is Vasyl Tarasenko, where the pointer is. That's Gromyko. That is Alexander Cadogan, the British ambassador. And over here, there is Warren Austin. And that is in the summer of 1948. And Tarasenko and Gromyko are making arguments against the Bernadotte plan. And the arguments that they make are identical to the arguments that are being made by Abba Eban, the Israeli representative to the UN, and Moshe Shertok, then later Moshe Sherratt, the future Israeli, the then Israeli foreign minister. It's very striking to read the memos, the documents of those debates, and you can see very clearly that the Israelis are finding their strongest support from the Soviet bloc at the United Nations. Let me go through a few images, and then I'll conclude. This is June of 1946. It's a photo of a rally in Madison Square Garden. The slogan says, "Escape for the Nazi Mufti, but no rescue for Nazi victims." This is a rally supported by the American Zionist Emergency Council, the American Jewish Conference. it is filled with denunciations of Ernst Bevin against, again, this is the sentiment of New York liberals on the left of June 1947. This is Henri Ponceau, the French High Commissioner in Syria, who spoke with Haj Amin al-Husseini in Paris in spring of 45 to 46. And Ponceau and others made the case that leniency towards Husseini would benefit French interests in the Middle East. This is Frida Kirchway, the editor of the leftist flagship The Nation, who wrote editorial after editorial denouncing the Arab Higher Committee for its collaboration as past with the Nazis, and argued in support for the establishment of the State of Israel, and was as one of the defining features of the meaning of leftism of 1945-46. This is Robert Wagner, the lion of the American New Deal, supporter of Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Act, who was one of the most fervent supporters of the Zionist project, and one who denounced what he called appeasement of the Arab Higher Committee. And there is Emanuel Seller, the most important figure in the United States Congress, who called for the indictment of Haj Amin al-Husseini, who challenged the State Department and supported the Zionist project, opposed the arms embargo, as a hero, and let me put it this, who is a leading figure in the opposition to the racist nature of American immigration legislation aimed at Asians, or people of color, or people from Southeastern Europe. The congressman from Brooklyn plays a significant role in the book. Here's Sumner Wells, who was Undersecretary of State in the Roosevelt administration, and wrote a book called We Need Not Fail, making the case against his successors at the State Department and their opposition to the Zionist project. This is Alfred Federkiewicz and Gromyko, and with Tagver Lee, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Alfred Federkiewicz was a Polish representative to the United Nations, and in May of 1947, he stunned his colleagues by saying that the Polish representatives that he understood that what the Nazis had done to the Jews, because he, Federkiewicz, was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he saw with his own eyes the Holocaust. There is Harry Truman and Secretary Marshall. That is Marshall at the Harvard commencement, where he delivers the Marshall Plan speech. And this is one thing to keep in mind, is the simultaneity of events of the beginning of the Cold War in the spring of 1947 and the controversies about the Zionist project. That here in Harvard Yard, the Marshall made the case for the economic reconstruction of Western Europe, and that was the main event. The main event was the beginning of the Cold War. Israel was the Jewish question in Israel. The Zionist issue was a sideshow, an irritant that might get in the way of the main event. There's Gromyko at the UN. That is Jamal Husseini there. And as you can see, he's a very Western-looking man, sophisticated man. The great tragedy is that the leadership of the Palestine Arabs in 1947 rejected the possibility of establishing their own state. The great tragedy. That is I.F. Stone, a left-leaning journalist. This is Robert Lovett, Undersecretary of State, and there is George Kennan, who many of you know as a historian and a distinguished scholar, marvelous writer, very shrewd diplomat, a great man in many ways. But in 1947, he also was an intellectual and said exactly what he thought, and he was quite clear about the damage that a Jewish state, in his view, would do to American national security interests. This is a memo, which I'm not going to be able to read, that is typical of the kind of memos that the British were sending to the United States. There in December of 1947, there's been a steady stream of Jews into Romania from the Soviet Union in the past 2 years. and many of them have been included in shipments of illegal immigrants to Palestine. And it goes on and on. Basically, the British intelligence and American intelligence was viewing the refugee stream from Europe to pre-state Palestine with great suspicion, because they viewed it in some ways as a NKVD effort to smuggle communist agents into Palestine. That is a photo of Secretary Marshall and Bevan expressing the special relationship between the United States and Britain at the United Nations in Paris. That's the main event, right? At the very beginning of the Cold War. This is the French Minister of the Interior, Edward Depreux. In Canada, given the importance of France, I hope that people will find those chapters of the book of interest, because Edward Depreux and Jules Moch, both members of the Socialist Party and ministers of the Interior, worked closely with the Mossad in facilitating then, quote, illegal, unquote, Jewish immigration to Palestine, infuriating the British Foreign Office as well as the French Foreign Office. And Moch and Depreux and the French Ministry of the Interior are the beginning of what became Israel's most important ally from 1948 to 1967. Its most important ally was not the United States. Its most important ally was the government of France. And the sentiments and passions and interests of that alliance have their roots in these in the years that the book examines. There's Clark Clifford, who told the president that the state of Israel would be an asset and not a liability. There's Chaim Weizmann and Eleanor Roosevelt, both of whom Eleanor Roosevelt was a supporter of the Zionist project. There's Truman Weizmann, and let's conclude with David Ben-Gurion, who is declaring independence on May 14th of 1948. On May of 1949, and I just have another 60 seconds, Andrea, and then I'll be finished. On May of 1949, the James McDonald, appointed as the first ambassador of the United States to the state of Israel, met with David Ben-Gurion. And the State Department was losing its patience with the state of Israel because it urged that the state of Israel in May of 1949 facilitate the return of Palestinian refugees. And Truman then signed a letter written in the State Department, which basically said to Ben-Gurion that if the Israelis were not more flexible on these issues, the United States would have to reassess its relationship with the state of Israel. And then Ben-Gurion replied, and there was the implication, after all that we've done for you, we would like to see you change your policy. And Ben-Gurion said that Truman's note ignored two fundamental facts. He could not recall any strong action by the United States to enforce the partition resolution or prevent aggression by the Arab states in May of 48. And the United States had supported an arms embargo, which Ben-Gurion argued encouraged the Arab aggressors against Israel when its very existence was in danger. And then David Ben-Gurion said to James McDonald, with whom he was on very good terms, that had the United States, had the Jews in Israel waited on the United States or the United Nations, quote, they would have been exterminated. Ben-Gurion wasn't raising his voice or yelling because he and McDonald got along, but he was simply stating what he thought the truth was. That when push came to shove and Israel needed weapons and more refugees, the State Department's policies were able to thwart those of the president. These realities of who supported and who opposed the state of Israel and its establishment in 1945, 1947, 48 have passed out of public memory, and to some extent they are not heard as often as they should be heard in the university. So it's my hope that that looking at that recalling the realities of those years will that a historian can make some contribution to having a more factually sound discussion of these very famous, but sometimes not very well understood set of events. Thank you.
Good, thank you. A number of the questions that I have, I see several have put into the chat as well as Q&A, so let me start. You reference in the book, but I don't think you said much about it here, the impact of oil or the desire for European countries like Britain and France to both have access to Arab oil. How significant a factor was that in their, I feel like, negligence towards the Jews moving to Palestine?
It was vital, crucial. On the one hand, there's a group of Arab countries that are countries, right? They have oil, and on the other hand, there's a couple 100,000 Jews in this little state, and we need the oil. So that was the thinking. I mean, like, this is not a very complicated issue, is it? Really? Right. So the issue of who has power, who has influence, did not cut in favor of the Jews. Now, Clark Clifford made the point to President Truman that the Arabs had to sell their oil to somebody. This is a period before the industrial development of much of the rest of the world, and so the Arab threat to withhold oil, Clifford argued, was hollow, and the president should call their bluff. But the consensus view articulated by William Eddy and others in the oil industry was not sympathetic to the Zionist project.
But I don't think much has changed where oil is.
Well, actually, I mean, this is a book about 4 years, and it's not a book about the American alliance with Israel that really emerged only after the War of 1967. So there's a lot of romance about the American alliance with Israel, but it really emerged inconsequentially after Israel established that after it won the war, and then the political ascendancy of Richard Cheney, for example, vice presidency, and the sympathy for Israel in the Bush administration, or Richard Nixon's decision to send weapons to Israel in 1973. I mean, these were post 1967 developments.
I think some people will find it surprising, as I did when I read your book, that Russia had played, first of all, we know a very dominant role in for the Allies in winning the war, but in supporting Israel, and then very shortly flips. Can you say a little bit more about that change? Because I think it's a factor today as well. People don't realize perhaps that Russia and its allies had so much positive support, but what is the basis of that, and why did it slip away?
Well, it was a mixture of power politics and sentiment. And for Stalin was obviously not a sentimentalist. Stalin thought that given the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union and on the Jews, and the fact that there were some Jews who would become communists, that perhaps a Jewish state in Palestine would be sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and if so, it would be an effective instrument to drive the British out of the Middle East. So for Stalin, supporting the Zionists was not especially costly, and why not try? This was his way of, quote, undermining British imperialism in the Middle East. Right? Now, for people like Andrei Gromyko or Alfred Friedrichs or some of the diplomats, there was also sentiment and memories of the Holocaust, and a sense that in that brief period of during and then after the war, that there was some, moral, emotional bond between the communists and the Jews. So both of those things were important. But when it became apparent in 1949 that the Communist Party in Israel gathered, I think, something like 2 or 3% of the vote, it Stalin understood that David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Chertok, while they may have been left of center politicians, sympathetic to some variation of social democracy, they were not communists, and they were Democrats, and that his bet on the Zionist entity as an anti-imperialist, rather as a pro-Soviet entity, had been mistaken. And Stalin's own anti-Semitism is well known. So the switch began in 1949, and with the switch and the anti-cosmopolitan purges, the officials in Prague who had participated in sending weapons to the Jews in 1948 wound up being placed on trial, and 11 of them were hung as Zionist spies and agents of Western imperialism.
Wow, that's an additional piece we didn't know.
That was at something called the Slansky trial. And I imagine many people listening in on this call are familiar with the Slansky trial.
So not in your book, but in today's world, the left has also flipped. Can you comment on that, on the fact that Israel's lost so much of the leftist support in the West, and is that reversible?
Well, historians think that the past is sticky, and much of what calls itself leftist in recent years, it repeats ideas that emerged, most importantly on the world stage, since the 1960s and 70s, when the Soviet Union and the Palestine Liberation Organization denounced Zionism as a form of racism, and those ideas persist. I myself am a centrist, or center left and center right, both, and firm opponent of Trumpism and all that. But one of the peculiarities of recent decades is the reluctance of too many people, both in academia and in the media, to address the reactionary nature. And this brings us back to the points at the beginning, the reactionary nature of the Islamist organization.
It appears that most of the countries have flipped one time or another. Again, when you emphasize France as an ally, but they refused to turn over the Mufti. So how that must have been partly anti-Semitism, not just that they wanted to work with the Arab Higher Committee.
Well, France, since 1789, France was divided, right? Things persist. There's a Catholic conservative France, and there's a Republican liberal France, and the French Foreign Ministry was reflected the influence of the Catholic Church as well, which was not happy about the Zionist project at all, on the whole, and also still thought that France had a civilizing mission in North Africa and in the Middle East, and so the France was divided, and the French Interior Ministry was striking in the support that it gave. The police forces, the intelligence agencies, the control of the port in Marseille, the all of that really facilitated, made a contribution to the establishment of the Jewish state.
Just a couple of additional questions. You're probably aware that I think the case has been made by President Abbas that he either intends to or has already brought a suit against Britain for the Balfour Declaration, which set the stage for Israel's reconstitution. So the question I would ask, is there any case that can be made by the Jewish state for the lack of fulfillment of the mandate for Palestine, in that Britain really was absent in regards to its requirements, the requirements that would have fulfilled the mandate?
The reason there was a war in 1948 was because the Arab League, the Arab Higher Committee, the Muslim Brotherhood decided to go to war. Ernst Bevin did not want a war. Britain didn't want a war. I think Britain gave some support to the Arabs.
Yeah.
But rather than legal suits or that kind of thing, it's important for there to be more accuracy about the causes of the war, and where perhaps a younger generation of Palestinian or Palestine Arabs, Palestinians, will be willing to confront some of these realities, that they had the opportunity for a state of their own long ago, and they turned it down. And that's the tragedy. Now they can blame other people and present themselves as the world's, foremost victim, but as we see, excuse me, the patience is running thin in the Arab world with that narrative as well. So, my preference in this presentation is to encourage people to read some history. I'm not presenting myself as somebody with an inside track on what we should do today. I have opinions about what we should do today. Some of them are pretty well informed, but a book like Israel's Moment is the result of years of work, and it's that I'd like to bring to people's attention.
So maybe we could just sum up with one other thing we spoke of before the webinar began, and I see several people added comments, and I had mentioned to you Dr. Christoph Gassenschmidt, so I want to do a shout out for him because he's here. And he mentioned Ken Burns' documentary. Can you spoke to me about it? Do you want to say how important or relevant you think it is for people to pay attention to?
It's well done. I think a film and a television program is different than a book, and it works differently, and it accomplishes certain things that a book cannot. I think that if you have an opportunity, it's very worth seeing. Many of you will not. There are many things in it that you already know, but there is the film footage. Some of the film footage is new, things I hadn't seen before, and I've seen a lot. So I think it is balanced and fair. It avoids some of the polemics about what the United States could and should have done or not, and didn't do or did do. One of the things the program conveys to some extent, it could have done more, and that is the extent of anti-Semitism in American society in the 1930s and 40s. And it was significant. The Nazi regime aimed its propaganda at the United States, probably at Canada too, by saying that this is there's a Jewish war. The Jews caused this war, and it's all about the Jews. And Roosevelt was very aware, and Churchill too, that making the war primarily about the Jews was Nazi strategy to play upon existing anti-Semitism. Asking mothers and fathers in Toronto and in Des Moines, do you want your boy killed to save the Jews, Christ killers? I don't think you want your boys killed to risk their lives to save the Christ killers. And Roosevelt and Churchill were fully aware of that. And so the United States and Britain did not wage an ideological campaign against Nazi anti-Semitism. I think they should have. It would have been difficult, but I can also see why they decided not to. So my friend and colleague, Deborah Lipstadt, who is one of the historians speaking in the U.S. in the Holocaust, makes what I think is the most compelling case of the various people speaking regarding the issue of anti-Semitism, how it was received in the United States, its impact on the war and all that. So I would recommend people seeing it. Many of the people on this call will be very familiar with a lot of it, but especially for younger people and people who don't know much about these events. If there are some teachers and professors who are listening to this call, you all will be familiar. You'll all know that one can never assume that people are well informed about various aspects of the past. Some of the most famous events are greeted with astonishing ignorance. So in that sense, I think that the program accomplishes quite a bit.
That's great. Thank you. And I'll do one more little plug for you because I'm finding
Right.
the quite intriguing.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Herf, for spending the time with us. I want to thank all of the folks that signed on today for our webinar. It's much appreciated. And special shout out to all of our sponsors. A slide will go up in a moment to show, there you are. These are all organizations, small and wonderful, that support CAEF's efforts to put these webinars together, and we're very grateful. Again, I urge you to support them. If they're near you and you're looking to get involved, these are excellent organizations with a common Zionist mission. And I look forward to working with them all again for the next program. Thank you very much. Take care. Shana Tova. Be well.